About the Pleistocene, Holocene history of San Francisco Bay and kind of go over some of the different research that's been done in the Bay by myself and by others. And so as a general outline of the talk, I'll start with the glacial history and then work up to the Holocene Bay, the last 10,000 years, and talk about early humans and shell mounds around San Francisco Bay. Some work on sediment cores that we've done, taken from the estuary, cores taken from the surrounding marshes and what they can tell us, and comparisons of these records with California, other paleo climate records from California. And I wanted to start by acknowledging a few people. First of all, Doris Sloan, who, if it weren't for Doris, I wouldn't be working on the Bay. It was actually Bill Berry who gave me Doris Sloan's dissertation. And back when I was a graduate student at Stanford, I was working on a different project, and I read her dissertation, and I was so excited about the fact that you could take sediment cores and look at the history of the San Francisco Bay that I switched over and switched paths entirely because of her. And she just came out with a really excellent field guide for the geology of the San Francisco Bay region that's published by UC Press. It's part of the California Natural History Guide. So I've been reading it, and it's really excellent. I totally recommend it. And also, I wanted to acknowledge my research group. Some of these people have graduated. Some are doing postdocs, such as Frankie Malamud-Rome, who's here. And Peter Schweikert has worked on the Bay as well. Okay, so San Francisco Bay is, of course, important to anyone who lives in the Bay Area. It's a focal point. It's an icon of the Bay Area. It's got a watershed that covers 40% of the area of California, receives fresh water through the Bay, and it has sediments that have been accumulating over the last at least 500,000 years that contain a rich history of California environment and climate. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that we think of it as a very permanent feature, but it's actually on these longer time scales, it only existed about maybe 10% of the time over the last 500,000 years when sea level was high during interglacials. And so this is a curve of sea level over the last 500,000 years, 500,000 years. And as you can see, sea level rose and dropped in response to ice buildup on land. And this is our present high sea level stand today. And I want to start with discussing the last interglacial, the last time there was a bay, 125,000 years ago. Okay. And so Caltrans, so when they were building the bridges in San Francisco Bay, the Bay Bridge and the proposed Southern Crossing, they actually cored to bedrock. And some of these cores were looked at by Brian Atwater at the USGS, and Doris Sloan did her dissertation on some of these cores. And so we really learned a lot more about San Francisco Bay from these bridge studies. And so this is a cross section going from Alameda to San Francisco, and plotted against depth in meters. So this is about 80 meters or 90 meters down. And this is showing the water in the bay. And here's the subsurface sediments. And these bluer layers are or greener layers are the estuarine deposits. So sediments deposited when there is a estuary. And then the red layers are the alluvium or fluvial sediments that were deposited when sea level was low, and the area occupied by the bay was a river valley. So you had a river going through during these times. And so you can see that they alternated, as you would expect, between the present interglacial, the last interglacial 125,000 years ago, and so on, going back at least 500,000 years. Okay, and just to point out again that a lot of this stratigraphy was done by Brian Atwater and others at the USGS, and then Doris Sloan did a wonderful dissertation on the last interglacial, when actually sea level was higher than the present interglacial by about 5 or 6 meters, and that she called that the Yerba Buena mud. And so Doris actually looked at the microfossils. She mainly looked at the foraminifera, but she looked at everything, really. I mean, it's amazing. So these are these microscopic, they're maybe the size of a pin, head of a pin, and they're one-celled organisms, the foraminifera, that secrete a calcium carbonate test or shell. And they act, and these are the diatoms that secrete a siliceous shell. And different species prefer different temperature, salinity, and water depth. So you can actually look at the various species, distribution of species, to say something about the conditions at your whatever location your core is taken from. And so that's what Doris did, and what she showed for the last interglacial was that sea level, well, we know that sea level was higher from other records as well, but she confirmed that in San Francisco Bay. So we had a larger estuary, higher salinity, colder water, so more like the coast. And actually the organisms were more like coastal organisms in the bay. And actually, when you think about it, it's an analog for what the future bay might look like under global warming as we have increased sea level. And this is showing the South Bay, and if I'm reading this right, this is from a slide I got from Doris. This here is the shoreline during the last interglacial compared to the present shoreline here. So quite a bit larger. Okay, so let's move on to, so after this warmer period here, it took about 100 or 80,000 years, cooling, building up ice on land. You reach this point of the lowest sea level where the glaciers had their maximum extent during the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. And so what happened then? So up in the Sierras, we have evidence for this glaciation. We have moraines, these jumbled masses of material carried by glaciers, polished bedrock with striations showing where these glaciers went through the bedrock, and then erratic boulders. So there's plenty of evidence in the mountains that we had a big glaciation. And just to remind you of how Yosemite Valley was carved by a giant glacier during this time, and this is the valley today. Okay, so in San Francisco Bay, sea level, 20,000 years ago, sea level was 120 meters below present sea level, and so the shoreline was way out here. And the area occupied by the bay was occupied by these rivers. And so there's these channels that are cut through the estuary that are the deepest parts of the bay today, cut by the rivers. And here's the Farallon Islands, which was a ridge back then. And in Doris's book, she has this, a couple sentences I really liked where she says you could actually, if it's a nice day, you could take a walk across the continental shelf and have a picnic out here on Farallon Ridge and look out to the Pacific, to your west. And she also says, you could have stood on the headlands above the Golden Gate and watched the mighty flow of the river as it poured through the valley, tumbling over great cascades of waterfalls. A roar would have filled the air as the meltwater from far-off glaciers sent floods through the Golden Gate to the ocean. So that's from her book, and I like that little passage. The other thing I wonder if you might have seen were some of the Pleistocene megafauna. And so in the Bay Area, there's fossil evidence for some of these things like the camels, the mastodons and mammoths, bison, giant sloths and saber-toothed tigers. And these went extinct by about 11,000 years ago. But it's kind of mind-boggling to think of what this area looked like then. Okay, so just looking at sea level rise over the last 18,000 years, we went from 120,000 years, or 120 meters below present sea level to where we are today. And the first humans arrived in California about 13,000 years ago. And then so they arrived when there was the megafauna still here, and then they became extinct. And as you can see, the sea level rose very rapidly until about 6,000 years ago, and then it slowed down until the present. So it was really around 6,000 years ago that San Francisco Bay reached its present size, pretty much. And this is a map showing the shorelines. So out here at 18,000 years ago, where I showed before, here's the Farallon Islands. And then it moved inland. And about 8,000 years ago, it started flooding the Golden Gate. And again, by about 6,000 years ago, it occupied this area, larger area. And that, again, is when the rate of sea level rise slowed. So it slowed from maybe 1 to 2 centimeters per year to only 1 to 2 millimeters per year between 6,000 years ago and the present. And so at this time, you began to form mudflats and marshes around the edges of the bay. And this is the time when there's evidence for the earliest human occupation. And if there were humans here before, the evidence has been either covered up by sea level rise or, we just haven't found it. So the oldest, mounds, shell mounds that we have from the bay date to a little before 6,000 years ago. And so around this time, it became, in Brian Fagan's book on early California, he calls it a landscape of shell mounds. There were over 425 mounds mapped around the shores of San Francisco Bay by Nels Nelson in 1906 to 1908. And unfortunately, most of these mounds are destroyed. They were either built over or bulldozed or destroyed in some way or another. But some of them were excavated and archived in various museums in the Bay Area. And these shell mounds were thought to be, they were built on mud flats, and it was thought that they were close to the resources of the bay, the new resources that developed as we had a new estuary here. And so some of these resources include the shellfish, clams, mussels, oysters, snails, that the clams burrowing in those mud flats, and mussels and oysters attached to the surface. There's fish that were migrating through, that's salmon, sturgeon, smelt, and so on. Waterfowl, ducks and geese, and there's marsh plants and small mammals and invertebrates in the marshes. And all of these are found in the shell mounds, so we know that they were consuming these things. And this is a stratigraphic column or section of a shell mound. This is the Ellis Landing Mound in Richmond. And so the shape of most of these shell mounds were oval, some were circular. They ranged between 10 and 150 meters long, and the long axis was generally parallel to the shoreline. And they were 2 to 10 meters high. The Emeryville was the largest mound at 10 meters high. And the West Berkeley Mound was about 6 meters high, the second largest. And these mounds were generally stratified, and with, of course, the oldest layers at the bottom and building upward. And you found, as I said, the shell, bird and fish remains, various vertebrate remains, and a substrate of mud or sand. And there were also artifacts found, various projectile points, pestles, and net sinkers for fishing. And there were also burials found in these mounds. This is the Ellis Landing site in Richmond, and it doesn't show up too well, but this is a lens of clamshells, and you can sort of see all these clamshells in here from this mound. And so here's the mussel, clam, various clamshells, limpets, and snails, oysters found in the mounds. And so the question, and it's still not totally resolved, is why did they build these shell mounds? And it's thought that they were residential sites. They actually lived on the mounds, and they intentionally built them upward to keep above sea level, because sea level was rising at 1 to 2 millimeters per year. They liked being close to the edge of the bay because they're close to the estuarine resources we talked about. They were burial sites, territorial markers, and there's evidence that they may have been seasonally occupied, so maybe only using them during a couple seasons and then going inland during the rest of the year and then coming back every year. And the shell mounds linked the occupants with their ancestors. So the ancestors are buried in the shell mound. The occupants were living on top. So these mounds and the ancestors controlled the surrounding territory and food resources around it. It was a territorial marker. For a long time, 20 to 40 centuries, if you think about it. That's a really long time to occupy an area like that. Many of the sites are surrounded by water at high tide. And this is, again, the Ellis Landing site near Richmond. There's a little hut on here now, but this is high tide, and it's surrounded by water. And the bases of many of the mounds are 1 to 2 meters below sea level. And that's because when they started building them, sea level was lower, and then they pretty much got submerged as sea level rose over time. They used these Thule canoes, and they would take them from these mounds at high tide. These canoes would allow them to get to the mound and get out into the bay for gathering mollusks, spearing fish, and so on. And this is the West Berkeley Mound. It was excavated in 1950, and they did it in a hurry before it was about to be destroyed in 1850, and it was actually sandwiched in between two buildings. And so the archaeologists went in and very quickly excavated before it was destroyed. And this is showing, so this is the excavation in 1950, and they excavated it, they actually excavated layer by layer, and they have 18 levels that they took. And these are archived in the Hearst Museum at UC Berkeley. And so this is a part of a project I actually, as part of my, a project I worked on, looked at these various layers. I did a radiocarbon project I'm about to describe here. Dating, so a very detailed dating of the mound. And I also looked at, from each level, I looked at both shell and charcoal. So doing a radiocarbon date from shell and charcoal pair from each level. And the reason that, this isn't showing up too well here, but the reason that I was interested in looking at these radiocarbon dates between the shell and charcoal pairs is that if you just date sites using shells along the coast of California, it's known that they are very unreliable. And the reason for that is that the dissolved carbon, the bicarbonate in the water, is very old, and it has to do with the thermohaline circulation in the ocean. So deep water is formed in the North Atlantic. It travels through the Atlantic and then finally into the Pacific. And then it is upwelled in various areas. But this is a very slow thermohaline circulation that takes about 1,000 years. So we have very, very old water in the Pacific Basin, and we have coastal upwelling. So this upwelling brings this very old water to the surface. And then the shells, that's the water that they're seeing, and they're forming their shells out of. And so they're actually incorporating very old carbon or depleted carbon of radiocarbon because the carbon's been decaying away this whole time. And so we have this term, the Reservoir Age, and that's just the age of the water. It's an apparent age of the water. And so the average age of the water, if you actually dated it, or a shell growing in it, would be 625 years. So, so you need to correct for that. And so this is a section through the ocean, the coastal ocean, with depth, and this is the radiocarbon age on the bottom here. So it goes from 0 to 2,500 years. And so you can see at the surface here it's about 600 years, and it gets older as you go down into the ocean. The water, the bicarbonate that's dissolved in the water is getting older and older. And so during coastal upwelling, you're actually upwelling, you're bringing to the surface this older water that's being incorporated into the shells. Okay, so the idea so we know what this is today, but the question is, how can you be sure that this value is the same in the past as it is today? Because in the past you may have had more upwelling, less upwelling, and so on. And so the study that I did was to look at the differences in the mounds. I think the next one shows more accurately, between a shell and a piece of charcoal from the same stratigraphic level, so that we know that they were deposited contemporaneously. They should be the same age. And always the shell is some degree older than this charcoal. The charcoal is getting its CO2 out directly from the atmosphere. So it's giving you the correct age, and the shell is always coming out older. So I went down through all the levels in that shell mound and looked at the pairs of charcoal and shell to see if I could see changes in this reservoir age through time, which would say something about how upwelling, for example, has changed over time. And I saw that in fact, it did change dramatically over time. So I actually did this in two places, in San Francisco Bay and in Santa Barbara Basin, and the Channel Islands have shell mounds. And so looking in these two different shell mounds, you can see that it varied over time, and this is over 5,000 years here, and this is going back to 10,000 years. And so these times this is the present level, the dashed line, and this is showing the times when the reservoir age was greater, so upwelling was greater during these times. And then during this period of time, around 3,800 to 4,000 years ago, upwelling was less. This reservoir age was less than the present. And you see a similar pattern here in Santa Barbara Basin. So greater here, and this is actually during the medieval climate anomaly, so it's warmer during this time, and then cooler and wetter during this time. So what I've shown here is the California, from other proxies, California paleoclimate trends. And you see an interesting relationship between this and general climate in California. When the reservoir age is lower, climate is cooler and wetter, like during the Little Ice Age. And then when this reservoir age goes up, it's warmer and drier, such as during the medieval climate anomaly. And then here's another period of time where it was cooler and wetter, and so on. It gets a little fuzzier back here. But it seems to be maybe a 2,500-year cycle there. Okay, and so here I'm just showing the stratigraphic column. This is the West Berkeley mound again. Here's a stratigraphic column going from the surface of the mound down to 6 meters. And I've plotted the age on the top here. So you can see it gets older with depth, going back to about 5,000 years ago. And you can also see that in the mound, there's a lot of different changes they see in what people were harvesting, what they were eating. One notable thing they see in a lot of these mounds is they switched from oysters to clams, and that happened around 2,000 years ago. There was this shift from eating mainly oysters and mussels to eating clams. The other interesting thing is that the top of a lot of the mounds from San Francisco Bay is about 1,200 years. And so it appears these mounds were abandoned, and the question is why? Why were they abandoned? And then they came back maybe 400 years later. So there's a gap where we see that there aren't people occupying the bay as much between about 1,200 and 800 years ago. Okay, so this brings me to the next part of the talk, which is talking about the paleoclimate research that we've done, and we'll come back to what our theories for the abandonment in a minute. In terms of the paleoclimate research, the bay is a really excellent place if you want to try to say something about how precipitation has changed over time, because in California, because as I said before, that the watershed for the bay is 40% of California, and it drains the Sacramento watershed to the north, the San Joaquin watershed to the south, and so the inflow into San Francisco Bay integrates precipitation and runoff over a really large area. And we're interested in knowing what was the long-term or long-time scale variability of freshwater inflow through the bay, and which would tell us, how has climate precipitation varied over a few thousand years. Okay, so, and just to remind you that on a seasonal basis, freshwater inflow to the bay is seasonal. We have high inflow during the winter and spring, and snowmelt during the spring, and then we have the dry season. And this is 1983 water year. This is, if you can see it here, 1977, which was the driest year on record. So that didn't see much variation. But this is just a 70-year record from 1921 to 1990. But I wanted to point out that from year to year, it appears that a lot of the extremes that we see, such as 1983, 1977, and so on, occurred during El Nino years. There also appears to be a more decadal variation in inflow to San Francisco Bay. And so the thing we're interested in is, are there longer time scales of climate change? And then we can see from this limited record here. And so that was really what made us want to look back into the sediment cores. And so the salinity in San Francisco Bay varies with freshwater inflow. So if we had a way of telling us what was the salinity of the water in the past, then we could get back to what was the freshwater inflow in the past. You have fresh water coming through here, it's mixing with seawater coming through the Golden Gate, and you have a salinity gradient. And so at any given point where we might take our core, salinity varies in response to the amount of fresh water coming into the bay. Okay, so this is just showing, here's delta flow or freshwater inflow. And again, that's seasonal. This is for 1998, seasonal inflow. And here is the salinity for that year. So you can see that they're mirror each other. It's a very close correlation between the two. And so what we wanted to use as a proxy for salinity is oxygen isotopes. And so we were interested in looking at the O18, oxygen 18 to O16 ratio, And I want to define this delta O18 here, which is also, well, I'll talk about delta 13C as well. But so the delta O18 is the O18 to O16 ratio in the sample that you're measuring, divided by the O18 to O16 in a standard, minus 1 times 1,000. So we're normalizing our sample to a standard and just looking at, so the values are in per mil relative to the standard, which is either a PDB or a SMO, standard mean ocean water standard, and this PDB is a carbonate standard. So we're actually measuring the oxygen that's in calcium carbonate. So the carbonate has oxygen in it that we're interested in knowing it's, and this in turn varies in response to salinity, and I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so salinity and delta O18 covary, and salt water or ocean water coming through the Golden Gate has a salinity of about 34 parts per thousand and a delta O18 of 0. That's because ocean water is the standard. So the delta O18 is going to be 0. Fresh water coming in has a 0, essentially, parts per thousand salinity, and it's lighter than seawater. So during evaporation off the ocean and raining, you actually preferentially evaporate O16. So your water is going to be, it has a negative value because it has less O18 in it. And so there's a big difference between these two water masses in the bay, and they vary in proportion to salinity. Okay, so what we did to prove this is we took samples of water in the estuary of different salinities, a range of salinities, and this on this axis should say delta O18. It got dropped somehow. And we measured the salinity and the delta O18, and you can see that there's a nice linear relationship between seawater up here and river water here. And so the river has these different values of salinity and delta O18, and then that is incorporated into the calcium carbonate shell. And that shell is deposited on the bottom and becomes part of the sedimentary record. So we can go back, take the shell out of the core, measure its delta O18, and we have an equation that will convert that to salinity during the time that the organism was alive. Okay, so we took cores from various locations in the estuary, and some of these are marsh cores I'm going to talk about later, but I'm going to talk about these red areas here. So San Pablo Bay, this one down from the South Bay, or South Central Bay, primarily talk about today. Okay, and I want to mention my graduate student, Peter Schweikart, who worked on a lot of these cores, and he's actually just finished up his dissertation. And this is what the core looks like. Can't see it that well. But, so we've gone out in various kinds of floating rafts and ships and all kinds of things getting these cores. And then we split the cores open and we look at the stratigraphy of the core, and we separate out the fossils. You can look at the pollen in there to say something about the vegetation. The mineralogy, what kind of minerals do you find in these layers? Are they stratified in terms of what's the bedding like? And of course then, as I've been talking about, we're looking at the isotopes in the calcium carbonate shell to say something about the paleo salinity. And the other thing we do is we X-ray the cores. And so this is showing an X-ray of a core. And these lighter bands are the denser material, shows up as lighter on the X-rays. And oftentimes these are shell layers or little sand lenses that are in these cores. And so again, we're looking at the O18 to O16 ratio in the shells. And the main ones we were looking at are mussels, Mytilus, Trossulus, and foraminifera. And remember, this is only maybe 1/4 of a millimeter across here. And this is Elphidium excavatum. Okay, and so once we take the fossils, we actually have to crush them up, and I know it breaks Doris's heart because we take her lovely forams and we have to powder them, and it goes through a mass spectrometer to get the isotopic ratios. And this is my research associate and technician Wenbo Yang. And I also want to mention we can do all kinds of isotopic ratios. If anyone's got samples they want run in our lab, we can do them on various materials. Okay. So this is one record that we generated. And so here's it plotted versus depth. So it's going from the top, 0 age, down to 6,000 years ago. And the delta O18 is plotted here, and the salinity is on the bottom. And I know it's probably really hard to make this out. So basically it's wiggling wildly. And then there's this period where we had no shell material. And this period back here between about 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, where actually salinity was lower. So the lowest salinity, the highest freshwater inflow, was back here around 4,500 years ago. Or actually the lowest salinity and highest inflow was about 3,800 years ago here. But this is generally still higher inflow than up here. It was higher salinity and lower inflow in this part of the record. And then these cycles, we figured out, had periods of about 55, 90, and 200 years. And I'll come back to the cycles later and talk about what that might mean. And for San Pablo Bay, the foram record, and again, Elphidium excavatum foram, we again see the cycles, but we also see this, there was a shift, a dramatic shift here at about 1775 years ago, where it got much more saline, so much saltier at this period of time. And so meaning less, so more freshwater inflow, lower salinity here, and then freshwater inflow decreased, so a drier period here. And unfortunately, we don't have the upper part of this core. It was disturbed by what was on the surface of it. So, but we are pretty confident we have this big shift, and I'm going to come back to this in a little while, because this shift is seen in a lot of places in California, a shift from wetter conditions to drier conditions around 1,800 years ago. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the marshes that we've cored around the bay. And this was the dissertation of Frankie Malamed-Rome, who's in the room. And she looked at changes in marsh vegetation using carbon isotopes and pollen also. And the other thing she's been looking at, she's got a Cal-Fed postdoctoral fellowship that just finished up, but she was looking at the sources of sediment to the marshes. So the detrital sediment that's reaching the marsh surface, and distinguishing Sacramento, San Joaquin versus local sources of sediment using the geochemistry of the sediments, these detrital sediments. And the marshes are sort of a sad story. 95% of the marshes around the bay are gone. They've been diked or filled over the last century. Recently, there's been an increased interest in restoring the wetlands around the bay. And so some questions come up, what do we restore it to? We don't really know what was there before. And so understanding what the vegetation was, the natural vegetation was, and how it varied through time is important. And also, we want to compare these changes in the marsh vegetation to changes in freshwater inflow. So how are the marshes affected by climate change? And so Frankie looked at a lot of sites in her dissertation. Today I'm just going to show this one site in Suisun Bay called Rush Ranch, where she did part of her dissertation. And you can't make him out here, but this is Roger Byrne, and I want to acknowledge Roger because he's actually the one who got me interested in looking at the marshes with Frankie. And this is actually a different marsh. This is Petaluma Marsh, which was another one that we looked at. But so we take these cores through the marshes, and we look at their stratigraphy, and then we sample at various intervals, say 1 or 2 centimeter intervals, to look at changes in the carbon isotopes and also changes in the pollen, which are going to tell us something about what the marsh vegetation was like. And you also have these lenses or layers of detrital or mineral-rich sediments that we see that could be, or most likely are flood deposits, although there's other hypotheses for why these are here. But I wanted to point out, toward the top of these cores, we often see a lens that we think is caused by hydraulic mining. So hydraulic mining in the Sierra foothills, a huge amount of detrital sediments were flushed through the system. They ended up in San Francisco Bay, especially San Pablo Bay and Suisun Bay, and they got deposited on the marshes. And so we actually can see those in our cores. And also it appears that flooding in general increased after hydraulic mining because these sediments are now choking the fluvial systems, and so you have more flooding going on in the Central Valley as a result. Okay, so getting back to the carbon isotopes, we can look at the carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio of plants. And this ratio depends on the photosynthetic pathway that the plants use. So that there's 2 general photosynthetic pathways. There's a C3 or the C4, and they have different delta C13 values. And so the C3 plants, which are more, they exist in lower salinity water, have a delta C13 of about -29 per mil. And those plants, the C4 plants that live in the higher salinity waters, they're more drought adapted plants, have delta C13 of about -13. And so this ratio is preserved in the organic material that's in the marsh cores. And we also use pollen as well. So looking at these 2 proxies, we can say something about salinity, how the marsh plants and salinity has varied in the marsh over time. And this is a very busy diagram, and it's actually, I owe it to Roger Byrne, who did the pollen work. And so this is a pollen diagram where you have different plant species here, or groups of plants, types of plants, and how they varied with depth in the core. And so I don't want to go into the details of that too much, other than to say that we see a consistent pattern. This is the delta C13 value. So to the right, it's getting more C4 rich, so it's getting drier, higher salinity. To the left, it's more C3 type plants, so lower salinity, to simplify things here. So you can see that there's gradual shifts in the vegetation that are probably responding to the amount of freshwater inflow coming into the estuary and reaching the marsh. And so it was wetter during, this is the Little Ice Age, about 750 years to about 150 years ago. And it was drier here, this is about 1750 years to 750 years, generally drier, so more of those C4 type marsh plants here. And then everything's screwed up at the top because we start diverting water. We change the whole situation. So we're not really looking at that as much in terms of a natural marker. But it does show that what we have now does not reflect the natural variability over the last almost 3,000 years. So very different now. Okay, so now I want to compare what we saw in these records to a few other paleoclimate records from California. And see if I can even see San Francisco Bay. Here's San Francisco Bay. And so I'm going to talk about some flood deposits from the Sacramento Valley. The Mono Lake records, so lake level records that Scott Stein did, and this is Roger Burns' work here. And then Santa Barbara Basin here, some cores taken from Santa Barbara Basin in Southern California. Okay, so I think Scott spoke here a few years ago, and he probably talked about Mono Lake, but I just wanted to remind you that so Mono Lake is a closed basin, and so over time, the size of the lake grows and shrinks in response to the balance of precipitation versus evaporation. So during times when it's wetter, you have more precipitation going in than evaporation is removing water. Your lake gets large, the lake level goes up, and vice versa. During dry times, the lake shrinks and the lake level goes down. And so this is a graph from one of Scott Stein's papers showing elevation. It's increasing to the left here versus time going back to 3,800 years ago. And so for one thing, 3,800 years ago, there was a high stand, and it was very wet, and this agrees with what we saw in San Francisco Bay. There was higher freshwater inflow. And a lot of records in California, actually, you see very wet conditions about 3,500 to 3,800 years ago. He doesn't have a record here, but starting about 1,800 years ago, a low stand. And again, this is where we saw very dry conditions, higher salinity, lower freshwater inflow in the bay. And then over the last 1,000 years, he starts seeing these 200-year cycles of wet and dry, so wet-dry cycles. And in particular, a very low, very dry conditions about 800 years ago and about 600 years ago. Okay, and he also, another piece of evidence that Scott had was looking at these submerged tree stumps, and this is Tenaya Lake in Yosemite, I think the Walker River, and I don't remember which river that is, but he looked at a lot of different locations in the eastern Sierra and mainly the southern Sierra, and saw that trees, there were 2 generations of trees that had, these areas had to dry up enough for these trees to become established and live to about 100 to 130 years. And so it was extremely dry from AD 900 to 1100 and 1200 to 1350 AD. And so this, during this period that is now called, it was originally called the medieval warm period, and now we call it the medieval climate anomaly because it wasn't just warm, but it was dry in some places, or both. And so getting back to way back when I was talking about the shell mounds, this is a period of time when in San Francisco Bay and along the coast of California, a lot of these shell mounds were abandoned during this medieval climate anomaly. And both inland sites and coastal sites appeared to be abandoned during this time. And it's thought to be due to, it was drier, you had reduced food and water resources, and because of this, the populations were actually really used to drought. They could move around during a drought and cover larger territories for food and water during these dry times. So they didn't stay in one place then. They started to have to move around in California more. And there's also evidence for increased conflicts and violence, and actually malnutrition. They've looked at the skeletal remains and seen evidence for violence and for malnutrition during this time as well, due to decreasing resources. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about wet periods, the flood periods. And so after the medieval climate anomaly, we move into the Little Ice Age, starting about 700 years ago. And we start to see it was cooler and it was wetter during this time. And this is just a photo of San Joaquin River from last year, just to remind us that, yes, we're worried about floods, and we're interested in what the frequency and magnitude of floods were in the past. And there's several records from the Central Valley. I don't have time to go through them all, so I decided to discuss this one that Roger Byrne and his graduate student Dan Sullivan worked on. And this was actually published in 1982. And they worked on an Oxbow Lake at the confluence of the Sacramento and Feather Rivers. And an Oxbow Lake actually forms when a meander is cut off from the main channel, and you have a sediment filling in this area, and eventually it becomes a separate lake. And so during flooding periods, when water and sediment are overtopping the banks of these rivers, they flow into these Oxbow lakes and settle out in the bottom. And so the sediment layers in these Oxbow lakes give you a nice record of past floods, past flood events. And so what they did is they went and cored this lake. It's called Little Packer Lake. And they x-rayed the cores so they could see flood layers in those x-rays. And they dated them with radiocarbon and various other techniques. And what they saw was that major floods, like the 1861 flood, whoops, because this is really, I don't know why it did that. Okay. Major flooding, like the one in the huge flood in 1861, occurred every 100 to 120 years. So much more frequent than people really think. A lot of people think that 1861 flood might just be a 1 in a 1,000 year flood. So I think more work has to be done on this to corroborate this, but that's what their results showed. And then they saw even larger than the 1861 flood every 200 years. Okay, and an even larger flood, one gigantic flood that occurred in AD 1615. And I'm going to come back to this because this is seen in other places. It was actually in Northwest California, a study by the USGS saw a gigantic flood in 1605, which was probably the same flood because of, dating problems. I mean, it was probably the same flood. And so other flood records come from the Santa Barbara Basin, where they've taken cores, the Ocean Drilling Project has gone in, taken cores, and you can actually see flood layers in those cores. And Arndt Schimmelman and others actually x-rayed the cores from Santa Barbara Basin and dated them. You can date them by counting their varves, so the annual varves you can actually count. And so these little red marks are showing the flood layers. They actually see layers that are terrestrial. They're not marine sedimentation. They're coming from, rivers draining into the Santa Barbara Basin. And so this is calendar years on the bottom. So starting with 2000 here, going back to 1. So the last 2,000 years. And so Arndt saw that there were these really large floods roughly every 200 years, really every 200 to 400 years. And interestingly, he saw that 1605 flood here, which was a very large flood, the largest flood in his record. because he's got the thicknesses of those layers, and this one's 5 centimeters, and these other two are 3 centimeters. And these occurred during the Little Ice Age. During the medieval climate anomaly, the floods were smaller. They weren't as big, but you did have floods. So you had flooding within these drought periods. Wet periods within the dry periods occurred. Okay. And I just wanted to point out, this is just a composite record of temperature in the northern hemisphere. So here's the medieval warm period, or we call the climate anomaly medieval, showing it was warmer and cooler during the Little Ice Age. And here we are up here. And so in California, it was generally drier during this time and wetter during this Little Ice Age. So more flooding, larger flooding events occurred during the Little Ice Age than during the medieval warm period. Okay, just to sum up that, that last 1,000 years, during the medieval climate anomaly, extended droughts, it was warmer as well. Looking at, I didn't present the tree ring data, but the tree ring and tree line data show there was a lower tree line as well. So it was warmer and drier. You had an increase in fire frequency during that time, so they can actually look at charcoal in lakes and the abundance of charcoal from fires. It was, the coastal temperatures were warmer. Cultural conflict, site abandonment from reduced resources. And then during the Little Ice Age, 1480 to 1850 years ago, wetter conditions, again, tree rings in San Francisco Bay and other records showing this. It was cooler. Glaciers advanced in the Sierra Nevada. You had a higher tree line, a decreased fire frequency, and cooler coastal temperatures. And I had talked about those periodicities in these climate records, and that longer time scale periodicity in the C14 Reservoir Age from upwelling, changes in ocean circulation, and the wet dry in California was about 2,500 year. The San Francisco Bay inflow saw periodicities of 90, 150, and 200 years. And then these flood records were actually 100 also, 100 and 200 year periodicities. Mono Lake level over the last 1,000 years had a 200 year periodicity. And tree rings, you also see this. And also if you go into Nevada and look at similar studies at Pyramid Lake, you see a 200 year periodicity. So this 200 year periodicity is showing up in a lot of records. And so the potential sources of climate variability could be longer time scale changes in the frequency and intensity of El Nino, and also the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which I haven't talked about, the PDO, but these two are related. And so studies have shown that you see maybe a 70-year cycle of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that's related to El Nino that might be affecting climate in California. Solar variability. So a lot of theories that there's these longer time scale sunspot cycles of 90, 200 years, and 2,500 years. And then for the longer time scale, maybe something causing changes in ocean circulation. And we can't rule out volcanic eruptions, but that's not going to cause the periods, but that may be responsible for some of the cooler periods, say during the Little Ice Age. There's one theory that some big eruptions caused that. And that's it. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Lynn to repeat the question.
Okay. Okay.
A couple slides ago, you were just presenting data on the temperature and climate and tree line. And you said during a warm period that you had a lower tree line.
Mhm.
It seems to me that wouldn't the tree line be higher during a warm period?
Okay, the question is, wouldn't the tree line be higher during a warm period? Okay, is there a tree person in the room? My understanding was that the tree, okay.
The tree line is usually means the upper line based on cold, but it must be the lower line in many mountain ranges based upon relative warmth. So I don't know what this refers to.
Okay, I think this is referring to the lower tree line. So yeah. So, okay. Thank you. Okay.
In your samples of the clams and the carbon in the quartz, you use the clams to infer upwelling on the coast.
Right.
I can't remember the term for the age of.
Oh, the reservoir age?
Yeah, the reservoir age. Isn't that contaminated by a variable extent from the carbonate coming down the rivers? Yeah,
that's a good question. So he asked when I was looking at the shell mounds and the shells with the C14, weren't they contaminated with or receiving radio or carbon from fresh water as well? And so, well, this was West Berkeley shell mound, which is sort of Central Bay, so it's a higher salinity. So I'm kind of assuming that it's mainly reflecting what's coming through the Golden Gate. But then comparing it to the Santa Barbara Basin, which is a marine, and I saw the same trends. So I think, you're right, you could get some radiocarbon coming from the rivers, but I think the dominant signal was coming from seawater coming through the Golden Gate.
How closely were those actually correlated?
They were pretty good. I mean, pretty good by our standards on, geologist kind of standards. But, they're, you're seeing the same general trends. I mean, they're, pretty good for given how far apart they are. But the thing is, I'd love to do more. Those are the only sites I've done, and I'd love to kind of see if I can reproduce that in any other coastal sites. So, okay.
Curious about sea level rise, and curious, you talked about this 1 millimeter annual rise that people were adjusting to. Is it rising faster now?
Okay, the question is sea level rising faster now than 1 to 2 millimeters a year? Yeah. And as far as I know, it's about 1 to 2 millimeters per year, but I think somebody in the room could probably answer.
It was over the last century, I think.
1 to 2?
Yeah, but and there's some evidence that it started rising faster in the last 2 or 3 decades.
Oh, okay. Okay, so he was saying it's actually starting to rise a little faster over the last couple decades.
Is there a correlation with some of these other time periods about how fast sea level was rising? During the, obviously sea level was much higher than it is now.
Oh, during the last interglacial?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, was there a change in sea level rise during those other periods? Or, similar to what he's talking about?
Oh, I don't know if, we can't get it that precisely in the Bay, I don't think, to compare it at that kind of level of a decadal level. And we're seeing more broad, you're averaging over decades to hundreds of year kind of level. So, okay.
The international record on that question is that the previous sea level high stand peaked and came down very sharply.
Oh, okay.
And the recent sea level high stand is anomalous in that it peaked and started back down, but it's going back up. So it's unique amongst the previous sea level high stand.
Okay.
Did you determine mercury or mercury oxides from the gold mining times?
Oh, that's a good question. We didn't, but I think others, the USGS has a group that's been looking at things like mercury and what else? Different neodymium isotopes. They have different kind of markers for gold mining, And they actually have detected that in some of their cores. So that's a really good question. Yeah.
I was wondering if those folds that were in that Atwater and Sloan cross-section that you showed in the beginning of the Bay sediments, is that an artifact of the way the cores were projected, or is that some sort of tectonic?
Okay, I'm glad Doris is here because I'm going to let her answer that question. Oh, okay. The question was in that cross section were the folds. What were causing those?
The foraminiferous evidence suggested that those were actually their faults running through the bay at that location, and that what he did was to smooth out what was actually today we would draw as sharp offsets.
Okay, so the answer was from faulting. Faulting is causing those and smoothing. Okay.
You're talking about the dry, warm period from 800 or 900 AD to 1100 AD and another period after that. Could that be fairly reasonably extrapolated to a larger geographical area than just the California coast?
Yeah, they've seen in the Southwest, they also have evidence for these medieval droughts and the Anasazi abandonment of sites in the Southwest.
I'm thinking of the Maya.
Okay, and that's the other place, the Mayan collapse that are during the same time. And so it does appear to be a broader effect going on. And I think Scott Stein is trying to see how far he can trace it. This is his real research area, and he's looking in a lot of different places to see what's happening during that time period. So, okay.
You mentioned something about a change from oysters to clams, I think. Could you clarify what's going on or why they shifted, or maybe you don't know?
Well, the theories are so this shift from oysters to clams in the shell mounds, a lot of the shell mounds, either that because the oysters and mussels are easier to harvest, they're at the surface, they think that they harvested those first, and then maybe they kind of depleted that resource, and so then they started going after the clams, which are buried in the sediment, and they're harder to get to. So that's one theory. The other is that it's just responding to changes in the environment. So because we do have a change from the wetter conditions to more salty, less freshwater inflow around that same time. So maybe it's a response to the environment. So that's it's not known for sure. So, okay.
I would just caution that it's looking at any change of that sort in one location could be very problematical. That this might be sedimentation at one place. You need sites, I think, scattered over a broad area.
Okay, so he was saying you need sites from broad areas, and actually they do see them in different mounds. They've seen that same pattern, and I actually even saw those in some of my bay cores. So that would argue that it's maybe more environmental than okay.
You said the first shell mounds, the old ones were about 6,000 years old.
Well, a little less, like maybe 5,700
Would you
years old.
expect to find older ones that are fully submerged by the rising bay as a resource for human?
Yeah, it's speculated that they probably did inhabit that river valley, and then as sea level rose, they just got buried, and we just haven't found them yet. So, yeah. Oh, yes.
Increase of salinity, does it bring anything else together besides salt? These mentions of plants that increase. How about your shell mounds? Does it increase of salinity bring anything else together?
What do you mean by bringing?
Well, is there more? You said there's certain plants that thrive when it's more saltier.
Yeah, I mean certain plants are more adapted to
Now,
saline.
Is there anything else that brought together with salinity?
Does anyone have an idea? I'm trying to think. Okay, so the question was, does the salinity cause anything else you can see in flocculation of clay particles.
Well, the shrimp,
I,
like, ammonia,
oh,
like increase in shrimp or something like that too?
I'm not aware of increase in shrimp, but I'm not a biologist, so I don't know if there's someone in the room that could think of something else that might respond.
Yeah, in an estuary, all the organisms have salinity ranges, so you always see changes in the kinds of species that you see.
Right.
As salinity changes, if it changes for a long period of time, you'll see changes in the species composition.
Right, just like Doris saw with her forams. See, I always think of these little forams, but I never think of the bigger things. Yeah, so, okay.
I was just wondering the use of salinity as a proxy for inflow. And I was just wondering, how did you deal with the changing volume of the bay?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, the question is, using salinity as a proxy for inflow, how did I deal with changing bay? As the sea level rose, it's going to get more saline just from that. And so actually that record I showed, it appeared to be more, fresher in the older part, and then it got more saline. And I think that might be an effect of just rising sea level. But there were some samples that sort of went against that trend that showed, and I think those were from increased freshwater inflow 3,800 years ago. But yeah, you're right. As you should see a general, increase in salinity as sea level rises and the bay gets larger. So that's a good point. Okay. No question?
Yeah. If we, for a moment, ignore the effect of the last 200 years of mankind affecting the weather, you would say that your projections are towards global warming anyway?
Okay, the question is, if you remove the human effect, would we be going toward global warming anyway? And I think I'm going to ask somebody, I think that actually we're getting to a point where we're starting to head back into an ice age. I mean, we've already peaked. The warming from the interglacial sort of already peaked, and it was actually, maybe starting to go toward a cooler. And so what we're doing is actually prolonging this warming, and taking it even warmer. Does anyone in the room have anything to add to that? Okay.
The oxygen isotopes that differentiate the present sea level high stand from the others show there's a peak, and then it started back down, but now it's going back up. And that reversal going back up, the oxygen isotopes showing slightly getting warmer, has been attributed by researchers at Columbia as possibly indicating the first influence of people affecting the environment through agriculture and forest burning. Now that's just a hypothesis, but it did peak and it started back down, and now it's going back up. And the problem is, are the mechanisms that drive climatic change powerful enough to overwhelm what we're doing to a human impact, or whether the human impact is just going to overwhelm it and drive it even higher?
Okay.
Yes, I'm curious about the nature of the floods. You said they were roughly floods every 110 to 120 years. They were larger floods every 200 years, and then the largest flood that you recorded was 1615. And what probability of occurrence are you assigning the 1615? Is that a 100,000 year flood, or is that
right?
What is that?
I think Roger and his student assigned the question was, what's the probability of the 1615 flood? And I remember them saying it was a 1,000-year flood. They think that it's about a
So when we're thinking of designing levees with a 50-year flood, we're kidding ourselves. To be reasonable, we know that the 200 years cycles are reasonably well documented. So if we're not designing for 200 years, we're sort of kidding ourselves.
Right. Okay.
Any more questions? We have a couple more minutes, or, okay, one more question.
Just kind of back to this gentleman's question here about anthropogenic effects and what's happened historically in the interglacial periods. That slide that you showed early on with the peaks in the interglacial periods seemed to show much higher peaks than the current one.
Yeah, I mean, it may have been exaggerated there, but it was about 6 meters higher during the last interglacial. And it was maybe 2 to 3 degrees warmer.
I should point out that only one of the previous peaks, 125,000 years ago, was higher. All the others prior to that were lower than present, slightly lower, and decreased as you go back in time.
This may be going more into biology than you want to go, but if San Francisco was a river and then turned back into an estuary over the past 6,000, 8,000 years, where did those species come from to be estuarine, and how long did their migration into the bay take?
Oh, that's a good question. Frankie, you want to try that one? Oh, the question was, so you went from a river to an estuarine environment, and what was the second part?
Where did those species come from that provided the base to form an estuarine system, and how long did they take to migrate into the bay?
So where did those species come from to form the estuarine biota? And Doris, or I'm going to let Doris or Frankie try to answer that.
There were smaller, in terms of marsh species, I don't know about estuary fish, but there were smaller marshes that fringed the coastline in little protected areas. And then for the freshwater, more brackish water species, there certainly was a wetland, wetlands plants that fringed the river system as well. So it wasn't all that difficult to repopulate, at least not for marsh species. It wasn't. It's always been, I think, a pretty good flyway for marine birds and plant species.
If I can make one statement about that, the gradient from out of Farallon Islands into the Golden Gate was 1 to 1,000, virtually flat. And so as sea level rose, there were much broader, much more extensive estuarine conditions and marshes out above the rising sea level than exists today anywhere in the bay. So it was an extremely broad estuarine situation, I think, strewn out along the coast. Freshwater marshes given to slightly more saline marshes. But they didn't last very long, but that whole ecosystem was shoved right up into the bay. That's number one. Number two, a lot of the organisms that you find in any ocean environment or estuarine environment, I don't know what the biological term is, but the clams, Belliger stage, larval stages are in the ocean water everywhere. And it's just a matter of finding a niche for them to survive.
Did you get one?
Yeah, there's some fishes in the estuary that are older than the time since the last glacial maximum. So they managed to hang out somewhere in this low gradient region to play a logical place.
Okay.
One last question.
What's the current rate when the bay became, when the rivers started entering the bay?
Oh, I think on the graph here it showed 8.3 thousand years ago, 8,300 years ago is when it started entering. Started entering the bay.
When the bay became the outflow for Central Valley.
I misunderstood the question, I think. Sorry.
About 570,000 years.
Okay.
The interior drainage of California spilled to the south prior to that, and about that time it came over parts of the straits, but it spilled into the bay. That was the first time.
Okay, so 570,000 years ago.
About half a million years ago.
Okay. Doris?
There's some evidence that I don't think has been published yet that the earliest sediments are as much as 1 million and that sediments, some pouring down around Alameda Island in that area. So I think you're talking about the Corcoran clay and when
No, I'm talking
the
about,
ash records.
No, I'm talking about the change in mineralogy in the
Right.
in the Merced Formation, south in the exposed in secrets in South San Francisco, and Tim Hall in his master's thesis here at UC Berkeley in the 1960s showed that up to about that day, all of the minerals in the Merced Formation came exclusively from local rocks, the local environment, and had a very precise horizon. It was marked by a shell bed, by the way. From that point up, then you started getting Sierra, as well as locally, you started getting Sierra mineralogy. And the Rockland ash, which lies just slightly above that horizon, and then some of Lynn's dates in that section a little bit lower, pin that period is very sharp when those minerals come in. Pin it, I can't remember exactly, 5 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, that's all in Doris's book too. No. Okay.